Joining us now to discuss this further is Dr. Dale Mckinley from Kopanang, Africa Against Xenophobia. A very good afternoon to you, Dr. Dale. Thanks very much for your time. Let's perhaps begin by talking about the significance of this case.
Sure. Hi, Vuyo, and thank you for having me on. I'm afraid my connection here is not very good outside the court, so apologies in advance if it doesn't come through clearly. But the significance of the case is mostly a constitutional significance. Basically, what the argument is that Operation Dudula's actions are a direct violation of the constitutional rights of all who live and work in South Africa, which include foreign nationals, which include those, whether undocumented or documented, that live in our country and work here. And their incitement of violence, their evictions, their actions that have been detailed by our council violate those constitutional rights. The second argument and the significance is that the Department of Home Affairs, the South African Police Services, and other government departments are not upholding those constitutional rights. In other words, they're not upholding the laws, and in fact, they're turning a blind eye oftentimes to these kinds of activities. So that is the essence of the significance of the case, which is about the dignity and the respect for the rule of law across the board, not depending upon one's nationality.
Now, here in court, the court heard about this new legislation which seeks to deal, with these sort of issues. But in what ways is this legislation, or the pending legislation that's still being piloted, going to avoid situations like your Operation Dudula's doing what they have been doing to foreign nationals? In other words, does it deal, for example, with how your police or your Department of Home Affairs don't rise to the protection of people? Does the new legislation deal specifically with those sorts of issues? In other words, forcing them or doing whatever can be done to actually get them to do their jobs?
Well, what our arguments are is that we have some good legislation. The problem is enforcement of that legislation. So we have the Refugees Act, we have the Citizenship and Immigration Act, but some of the new legislation understands the constitutional obligations and addresses those things. But the gap between the legislation and the implementation is oftentimes fairly large. But there is a particular problem that we're raising with the immigration bill, which is Section 41 of the immigration bill in particular, which was raised by our council, which we believe is unconstitutional, that piece of legislation, because basically what it does in our arguments is that it allows Operation Dudula, it allows Department of Home Affairs officials and SAPs to basically target foreign nationals without warrants, without due cause and reasonableness, and including minors, by the way. And so we believe that this needs to be remedied constitutionally. So there are a few pieces of legislation which need some attention, but mostly what needs attention is the implementation of existing legislation, which is not bad in its principle, but is not very good in its application.
But I know, obviously, court rulings and new legislation will go some way in actually dealing. But are we dealing with the underlying cause or the sort of issues that actually make the ground fertile for your Operation Dudulas or people behind your Operation Dudulas to do what they have been doing and getting away with it? What are those conditions that are enabling what your Operation Dudulas get to do and get away with?
Sorry, Vuyo, if you could just repeat, I lost the last part of your question.
I was saying, what are the conditions on the ground that enable your Operation Dudulas or people behind Operation Dudulas to do what they are doing and get away with it?
Yeah, so I think this is an important question because we recognize that there are serious problems with our immigration system. We recognize that there are a lot of poverty and desperation within communities and that people are angry about their socioeconomic situation. And basically that kind of milieu or that kind of terrain is fertile ground for Operation Dudula, because what they're basically doing, and particularly through their social media campaigns, is they're taking advantage of people's desperation and their legitimate anger at our government and at the socioeconomic conditions they find themselves in. And as we've seen in the United States and as we've seen in Europe, the easiest targets are immigrants. You blame them for taking jobs, you blame them for doing a crime, you blame them there. And so that's what Operation Dudula is swimming in that sea. And it is quite a fertile ground for them. And that allows them to get some support. Although we want to point out that nowhere does Operation Dudula have mass support anywhere. They have no, what we see small groups of individuals in particular locations basically engaging in these activities. But as a movement, when Operation Dudula attempted to form a political party in the last elections, they got less votes than we have as members of KAAX.
So if we were to strip it naked, who is not doing their job that then allows or get your Operation Dudulas to then do the sort of things or mobilize communities in ways that they have been able to do, even though, as you say, they are not necessarily mass-based organizations or institutions?
Yeah, so I think the real number here of Vuyo is that our government departments, and particularly Department of Home Affairs and South African Police Services, need to implement the law. And that's what we're calling for. We're basically saying that, we have, our Constitution says equal application of the law. It doesn't say you don't have certain rights because you're from Zimbabwe and you're in South Africa. It doesn't say you have certain rights because you're LGBTIQ or whatever the case might be. So what we're saying is that where the real impetus lies here and where the real concentration should be is in implementing that law.
Dr. Dale Mckinley's line giving us problems there, but we got the gist of it following, of course, that case that is in court where he also is the High Court hearing arguments on that Operation Dudula matter. A story, of course, we are keeping our eyes and ears on.